Welcome to Historical Period 4. We embark on the path of 1914 to the present, and this is the last push, or offensive if you will, in AP Euro as we push towards that ever-looming deadline in May. A quick review of what we've been going over recently. And, we're in the midst of Chapter 25, and as we know, European politics and diplomacy in the 20th century were defined in World War I by the total war and its consequences. World War I destroyed the European balance of power, and the Treaty of Versailles, which we'll learn about, that ended the war, created unstable conditions in which extremist ideologies emerged that challenged liberal democracy and the post-war settlement itself. In Russia, hardships during the war gave rise to a revolution in 1917. The newly established post-war democracies in Central and Eastern Europe were too weak to provide stability either internally or in the European state system, especially in the looming Great Depression of the 1930s. The League of Nations, established after the war to employ collective security in the interests of peace, could not manage the international tensions unleashed by World War I. During the war, states increased the degree and scope of their authority over their economies, societies, and cultures. The demands of total war required the centralization of power and the regimentation of lives of its citizens. During the war, governments sought to control information and used propaganda to create stronger emotional ties to the nation in its war efforts. And ironically, these measures also produced the distrust of traditional authorities. And at the war's end, four empires dissolved: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and the Russian empires. But the democratic nations that arose in their place, lacked the tradition of democratic policies and suffered from weak economies and also ethnic tensions. Even before the end of the war, Russia experienced a revolution and a civil war that created not only a new state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR, Soviet Union, but also a new conception of government and socioeconomic order based on communist ideals. So, ladies and gentlemen, in summary, there is a boatload of information going on here. And we're going to pick up where we left off in the reading, and we're getting into the widening of World War I. And as we talk about the widening of World War I, both sides sought to gain new allies who actually might provide the winning advantage. If you remember in Section 1, we ended essentially with a stalemate and slaughter on both sides. Now the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire, November 1914, joins the Central Powers. As a result, Russia, Great Britain, and France all declared war on the Ottomans in November. And this was kind of a big deal. You're probably asking why, who cares, why isn't it really focused in your book? But it's because that location, it closed the Turkish straits, if you will, the Turkish straits to the Allies. And the Western Allies then were going to be unable to ship vital war supplies to the Russians, who, as we know, at the early stages of the war, were struggling mightily. So a young whippersnapper named Winston Churchill, who was the first British Lord of the Admiralty, pushed for a campaign to open these straits. And in February of 1915, the British launched an amphibious invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula at the southern end of the Dardanelles Straits. The invasion was a fiasco, really due to a bunch of errors in its planning and execution, and by 1916, January, the British withdrew. And it's kind of an ironic twist of fate. Winston Churchill is embarrassed. Winston Churchill kind of retires from office and goes through a little withdrawal himself. And eventually he's actually going to join the war effort himself as a soldier in order to kind of restore the prestige and honor of his family. And thank God he did, because obviously he's going to make a difference in leading the Allies' charge as well as Britain's in defeating the Nazis in World War II. So while the Gallipoli campaign was in progress, Bulgaria in September of 1915, they enter the war on Germany's side. And by October, so the Central Powers were growing. And, why would they grow? Well, Bulgaria had been at odds with Serbia over land and territory since the Second Balkan War that you read about in Chapter 24, and hoped to get back at them. And Bulgarian forces helped Germany and Austria crush the Serbs by the end of 1915. A continuation of this topic of the widening of the war, both sides sought to gain new allies for that advantage. And, again, if you can see by this map, you see the new antagonists, and you can see that, down the middle, it's why they were called the Central Powers of Europe. Pink on this map are the Central Powers, and you can see you got Turkey, Bulgaria, you got Austria-Hungary, and of course you've got Germany. Now, additionally, the Allies were busy trying to gain support and gain allies. Italy, by May of 1915, joined because France and Britain promised them new territories at the expense of Austria-Hungary. Essentially, that once Austria-Hungary is defeated, they're going to give Italy land to expand their empire. Italy won't do so hot. They're not going to do so great, and the Western powers continually, seemingly have to bail them out of combat trouble. And so by the time of the Treaty of Versailles and self-determination and Woodrow Wilson, it's going to be Italy that leaves the peace delegation in Versailles, because they're upset. They know that they're not going to get the land that they were promised. Portugal also joins by March of 1916, Romania August 1916, Greece by October of 1916. And of course, let's not forget, we'll get into this here in a second, but the United States will also join the Allied cause by the April of 1917. Now, by 1917, the war begun in Europe was having an increasing impact on other parts of the world, as you can kind of see to the right of your screen. This is one of the key concepts on the new AP curriculum. And despite the disaster of Gallipoli, elsewhere the Allies were taking it to the Germans and the Ottomans and the Turks. The Russians had succeeded in turning back a Turkish offensive in the Caucasus Mountains, and the Turks began to deport and massacre. And this is one of those examples of genocide that I'm going to bring up again throughout this broadcast. But the Turks began to deport and massacre the Armenians, whom they accused of aiding the Russians. So we're going to start to see this trend of we've already talked about it with the Dreyfus affair a little bit. After France was embarrassed by the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War to blame Jews, it's not just going to be Jews, it's going to be entire other races. And unfortunately, early 20th century, mid 20th century, this sort of becomes the norm. Just kind of one of those disgusting parts of our history. And with the Turkish Straits closed to Allied shipping, the British hoped to open a route into Russia through the Turkish-ruled Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. And on March of 1917, the Brits seized Baghdad and took control of most of Mesopotamia in current-day Iraq. Under the leadership, they did this, of a British officer named Colonel T.E. Lawrence, who was also known as Lawrence of Arabia. The Brits incited Arab princes to revolt against their Ottoman oppressors, or the Ottoman overlords, again, using nationalism to kind of create discontent and disrupt the Ottoman Empire. And by 1917, Brits will invade Palestine, capture Jerusalem by December, and in 1918, British forces from Egypt, New Zealand, and Australia will destroy the rest of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. Now, Germany's lack of naval strength allowed the Allies also to seize German colonies around the rest of the world. Remember, Germany had decided to focus on U-boats because they really didn't think that they could compete with the infamous dreadnoughts of the British fleet. An example of this going on was in Africa, where the Brits invaded Togoland, and the Allied governments drew their support from mainly African soldiers. Some states like France actually used and recruited black troops to fight for them back on the Western Front in Europe. 170,000 of them, African troops, will go to fight in the trenches. Over 80,000 were killed or injured in Europe alone. So African troops were at a disadvantage, thanks to being unfamiliar in Europe with the terrain and climate. And in addition, many of them were used for labor, carrying supplies, building bridges, roads, doing the dirty work, and subsequently a lot of them will die of disease and starvation. Now, German African colonies were also subsequently transferred to the winning Allied powers. And again, mainly those German colonies will go to Britain and French. So, again, we've talked about a German, disadvantage to compete navally across the way around the world. And, again, when we talk about the loss of German colonies, we need to remember an important synthesis statement. An unintended consequence of this that's going to shape later history is that a lot of these African soldiers, like the ones in this picture, who had gone to war for the Allies, especially those who left Africa and fought in Europe, will become politically aware of what it's like to live in Europe, and they will begin to push for social and political equality they saw in Europe and bring it back to Africa. In some cases, educated African elites who had aided the British and French in actually enlisting a lot of these African people, local people, to fight. The reason why they did that in the first place was because they believed that they would be rewarded with dual citizenship in Britain or in France, and subsequently get new political and economic possibilities and opportunities after the war. When they realized that that was not going to happen, they too became frustrated and soon became involved in anti-colonial movements. And we'll see these anti-colonial movements in chapter 26 in the interwar period, and we will also start to see the decolonization by European countries after World War II. So here's another example of French African troops, and again, they drafted more than 170,000 of these West African soldiers to fight in Europe. And this photograph, they're showing French troops from Senghol arriving in France in 1915, and again, they will later fight in the Marne campaign on the Western Front. The French army set up a photographic service to record various aspects of the war. And let's not forget about the entry and the impact of the United States on World War I. The United States tried to remain neutral in the Great War, but it found it very difficult to do so as the war dragged on. In fact, you can see some propaganda here, campaign paraphernalia from Woodrow Wilson as he ran for re-election in 1916 as the president who kept us out of war and would continue to keep the United States out of war. And subsequently, although there was a considerable sentiment for the British side in the conflict and the Allied powers, the immediate cause of American involvement and why the United States becomes involved grows out of the naval conflict that exists between Germany and between Britain. Now, we've talked about Britain had superior naval power, and they will use this power to a maximum effect by imposing a naval blockade on Germany. What they did, not only with their ships, they used a huge, large minefield, a mine barrage, if you will, to harass neutral ships in the North Sea, including those of Germany. The mines make no distinction between contraband. What I mean by contraband is munitions and raw materials needed for the manufacture of war materials going into Germany, and non-contraband materials such as food and clothing that was destined for Germany. Basically what I'm saying here is this minefield will totally isolate, will totally blockade Germany from outside help. And coincidentally, not long after the beginning of the war, there's a large portion of German civilians who are starving. Okay, and again, the book talks about potentially 750,000, almost a million German civilians who will lose because of this blockade. So, unbiasedly, you got to look at why did the Germans step up and use unrestricted submarine warfare? Why were the Germans using U-boats to destroy British shipping? Why did they use U-boats to destroy the Lusitania? You really, as a historian, you've got to look at it from essentially both sides. Now, the other thing I want to make sure you're aware of is, why didn't the United States know this was going on? Well, maybe the higher ups in power did know it was going on, but one of the infamous things that the Brits were able to do was cut the transatlantic cable line of communication between Germany and the United States. All of the news that we've got coming out of the early stages of World War I were actually biased, and they were from the perspective of the British. So, Germany, in response to this blockade, declares the area around the British Isles a war zone and threatened to torpedo any ship caught in the North Sea or the adjacent waters to England. In fact, here is a warning here, and again, it says Europe. This is an advertisement for go to Europe via Liverpool on the Lusitania, and this will actually leave. I'm trying to see the origin here on May, and it's going to leave. I don't know if it left New York or Philadelphia or whatever, but it left port in the United States. So there was a substantial amount of Americans on this boat. But here it is right here, signed by the Imperial German Embassy. They actually published, they said, if you are going to go on a British ship and you're going to go on a ship that's going to travel to England, there is a threat that you will be blown up, because they knew that not only did a state of war exist between Germany and England, but they also knew that the Brits were smuggling goods made in the United States, war goods, I should say, on passenger ships, essentially using passengers as human shields. I'm sure the United States government knew this as well, and what ends up happening is the Lusitania on May 7th, 1915. But, there were, even before the Lusitania, strong American protests over the Germans sinking British passenger liners, but they culminated with the British passenger liner, the Lusitania, which actually did have munitions on it. Just so you know, that's why the Germans blew it up. They had, they had war materials on there going from the United States to Britain, and basically they blew it up. Now, there were 1,200 passengers that perished, including 188 Americans, and this is, again, protest, outrage in the United States and a lot of the Western nations actually forced the German government to modify and later suspend completely its use of unrestricted submarine warfare. But however, later they're going to take a gamble, and they believe that they can finish off the Allies before the United States could actually make a difference. And on January 31st, 1917, the Germans proclaim the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and Wilson severs diplomatic relations with Germany 2 days later. In April 1917, 870,000 tons of shipping was sunk, causing more and more companies, that want something done about these German atrocities, and the fact that American businesses are in fact losing money. So a little bit later on, the sinking of 3 additional American freighters, coupled with the British government making public something called the Zimmermann Telegram, or the Zimmermann Note, in which a German foreign minister sent a telegram to Mexico saying that, hey, if you fight a war with the United States and keep them out of World War I, and we win, we will give you areas, if you can see on the map here, of Texas and Arizona, as well as New Mexico, and even maybe California, which the United States had confiscated, obviously, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 as a result of the Mexican-American War. And so again, the Germans are saying, hey, in our own backyard, Mexico, you fight the Americans, and we will reward you handsomely. So in the midst of this, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson asked Congress on April 2nd, 1917, to declare war on Germany. And Congress made its official declaration April 6, 1917, and Germany badly underestimated the U.S. ability to mobilize quickly and fight effectively. And for all practical purposes, this miscalculation would cost the Germans the war. So although, American troops don't arrive in large numbers until 1918, the entry of the United States into the war in 1917 gave the Allied powers a much-needed psychological boost. And again, they launched Allied offensive in 1917. But again, you need to know that it wasn't overwhelming success. In fact, a lot of the Allied offensives in 1917 were disastrous. Additionally, in 1917, as you'll know in the next lesson, there was a Bolshevik revolution in November of 1917, in which it led to the withdrawal of Russia from fighting alongside the Allies, and that was actually a huge boost to the Central Powers' morale. Now, World War I was one of the first major engagements or wars since the Second Industrial Revolution. We've already discussed that the stalemate led to digging of trenches, complete with no man's land, landmines, barbed wire, and machine guns, which could put out about 500 rounds per minute. German U-boats, we've discussed the destruction that they did. And also airplanes start to appear on the battlefront by 1915, first to spot enemy positions and then to attack ground targets. Later, after that, machine guns were soon mounted to the noses of these planes for aerial combat. Germans also used airships called Zeppelins to bomb England. Tanks were introduced by the British in 1916, and they were designed to create movement on the front and break the stalemate out of the battle of the initial Battle of the Somme. They weren't really successful at first, but by 1918, tanks became legitimate technology implemented by both sides, especially they would be used more reliably in World War II. Additionally, again, this is from the AP Key Concepts. Poison gas also was used to move troops out of the trenches by asphyxiating them. It burned their lungs, left blisters. Some of those men died in their own blisters in their lung when the pus and the popped out of the burn marks and left them. If they survived that, they also were scarred for life or died. Mustard gas is as rumor has it, Hitler was gassed in the trenches in 1917 or 1918. Now, one of the important aspects of World War I is the implementation of something called total war. So not only do you have the actual Eastern and Western Front, you also have something called the home front. And the impact of this total war, which affects the lives of civilians even away from the battlefield, was tremendous. And its tremendous burden forced governments and their economies to literally transform. Germany alone had 5.5 million men in active units by 1916. The world had never seen anything like this war. Most nations implemented a form of conscription or drafting men to provide the human resources necessary to fill the void of the devastating losses being suffered on both the Eastern and Western fronts. The United States even implemented the Selective Service Act in 1917. Economically, World War I witnessed the European governments begin to take full control over all aspects of their economies in order to basically remain effective. And we'll talk about we can rank these from most effective, from most to least. Germany, we'll give you some examples here, was one of the most effective governments to take control over the economy. And in the end, the book mentions German Walter Rathenau, which was the head of the German General Electric, used his business methods to organize the War Raw Materials Board, which allocated strategic raw materials where they were needed the most. And governments also took control over businesses, railroads, etc., much like the United States did during the U.S. Civil War. A lot of these countries learned the implementation of total war from the Union Army under General Grant in the final stages of the United States Civil War, roughly from 1864 to 1865. Britain was also very good in taking control over all aspects. France was okay. Italy was really bad at it. Austria-Hungary bad. Russia was just horrendous, and Russia's on its way out, as we mentioned. In fact, the European states fighting in World War I had to also effectively organize masses of men and women and raw materials for years of deadly combat, and this led to increased centralization and expansion of government powers. Also, an example of this would be Germany's Auxiliary Service Law of 1916, which required all male non-combatants between the ages of 17 and 60 to work in jobs crucial to the war effort. So not only could you get drafted into the military if you weren't fighting, many, especially skilled labor, were forced and drafted, if you will, into important jobs to produce really essentially the goods needed to carry out the war effort. Economic regimentation of entire countries also existed. An example of this would be Britain's Ministry of Munitions. And basically what they did was to ensure private industry could continue to produce war materials at limited profits and not totally get rich. They started to kind of put a cap on what some of these companies could actually make in terms of profit. So essentially businesses start to become state regulated. Even in the United States, the government told many of the big businesses what they were going to make, how much they were going to make, and again, it was all in for the war effort, and that was it. And if you we'll get into this, if you rejected that or if you complained, you were a traitor, and the ramification for that could be just crippling. So, again, England began to take control over all aspects of the economy, and the book mentions England watching so too many skilled workers didn't enlist, because if too many skilled workers enlisted, then there would be nobody home to make the sophisticated war munitions. All right, as the war waged on with no end in sight and casualties mounted, so did the opposition and the civilian morale. Opposition to the war, and then again, just negative civilians thinking, when is this ever going to end? Does the government even know what they're doing? The army sucks, this and that. So as a result, there were strikes, violence like that in Ireland on Easter Sunday in 1916, which was known as the Easter Rebellion. We know that some of the civilians, some of the citizens within these countries, both Eastern and Western, don't really care for, the powers that be that are calling the shots. And mostly the opposition comes from liberals and socialists who call for peace negotiations without any territorial acquisitions. In other words, they are also anti-imperialist. In some cases, mutinies in the army were mounting. And traditionally, the authoritarian regimes like Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany were used as suppressing tactics like Metternich, again, synthesis here, Bismarck, and even the repressive autocratic Alexander III in Russia. However, what World War I created was the need for even parliamentary or republican forms of government to feel the need to additionally suppress their domestic opponents internally. Unscrupulous manipulation of the public through mass propaganda and government control of information. An example would be France executed on the grounds of treason an editor of an anti-war newspaper, and the punishing of journalists who wrote anything negative about the war and what was going on there. Heck, even in the United States, George Creel had the Committee of Public Information, and we had our own propaganda machine right here in the United States. Another would be the DORA, the Defense of the Realm Act in England, which allowed public authorities to arrest any dissenters that they deemed necessary as traitors. So, and again, another one from the United States is we passed the Sedition Acts in 1917. So controlling the people, controlling the economy was paramount. Now, again, this was also important in Germany, where you have the wartime leaders of Germany, in particular here, really enlarging their powers in order to meet the demands of the war. Here you have two military heroes of the war, Paul von Hindenburg on the left and Erich Ludendorff on the right, were basically virtual military dictators by 1916, and the two are shown here with the Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm at the center, whose power declined as the war waged on. So in order to, we mentioned the Creel, the committee, George Creel in the United States and the Committee of Public Information, you also had this going on in a lot of the Western countries, both Central and Allied powers. And so you had essentially propaganda machine to get people to fight, to enlist, to preserve food, to ration fuel, to ration food, basically to sacrifice everything for the good of the country. And even in this case, you can see here, demonizing the enemy. And this is where in the United States we get Halt the Hun. So again, you need to know the influence and power of propaganda. Here's some additional propaganda here to get you all fired up as we move forward. Now, to ensure that labor problems didn't derail a nation's war effort and wouldn't disrupt production, war governments in Britain, France, and Germany not only sought union cooperation, but also for the first time allowed trade unions to participate in making important government decisions on labor matters. This partnership between labor and government opened the way to collective bargaining and increased union membership. It was kind of a way that even in Republican or I should say conservative countries, they started to make concessions in order to keep the war effort going and keeping the war effort going smoothly. So with so many men off fighting, women additionally were called over to take jobs and responsibilities that had not been open to them prior. You need to know this. This is enormous. In Britain, over 1 million women obtained new jobs or replaced men during the war. In France, 684,000 women worked in armament plants for the first time. And by 1918, 38% of all workers in Germany, in Germany's Krupp armament works, were in fact women. And often women were not welcomed by male counterparts with open arms. And women at the war's end had little job security. Many of them were forced back into their old domesticated jobs and sexist jobs. But we need to know that women's contribution to the wartime economies did reap political benefits for women a little bit later on, as women were given suffrage on the national level. Examples of this is women obtained the right to vote in Great Britain by 1918. In Germany and Austria, immediately after the war's conclusion, they were given suffrage. In the United States, by the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1919 and went into effect in 1920. Expectations for women during the war were that they would return to their normal lives when the war ended. An example of this would be 650,000 British women were rendered unemployed at the war's end. So World War I acted really as a great social leveler, in essentially in that death rates at the front during the war were so high for all soldiers engaged that regardless of their prior social status, but mortality was especially high for junior officers drawn largely from the nobility and unskilled laborers and peasants comprising the mass of infantry troops. So again, a machine gun did not care if you were nobility. A machine gun doesn't care if you're a peasant. If you're in the way of a machine gun that could throw out 500 rounds per minute, it's not a good thing for you. So the groups within societies that benefited most from the war were wealthy industrialists, especially those making arms and munitions, and then also the skilled and highly skilled workers. Additionally, one of the consequences of the war that wartime inflation really hit the middle class, and particularly those living on fixed incomes. Who would live on fixed incomes? Those collecting pensions and older Europeans. Here's another example of propaganda and role at once. Women working in munition factories in World War I. Again, we talked about they got new opportunities. They were employed in jobs that had been considered beyond their capacity in earlier generations, and as seen as the picture above, British women dressed in caps, smocks, making munitions in the armaments factories. And as the recruitment poster here shows, the British government encouraged women to work in the munitions factories. Why? To aid the war effort. So women working in these factories were oftentimes nicknamed munitionettes. Just like in World War II in America, they're going to be called Rosie the Riveter. Okay, during the last year of the war, for Germany, the withdrawal of the Russians as a result of the Russian Revolution from the war and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk offered renewed hope for essentially a favorable end to the war. And in an effort to end the war, the Germans launched one of the last grand offensives in March of 1918. German forces succeeded in advancing 42 miles to the Marne, within 35 miles of Paris. On July 18th, French forces led by Ferdinand Foch, supported by 140,000 fresh Americans, defeated Ludendorff's German forces at the Second Battle of the Marne. After this defeat, the Germans realized that the war was lost as the Allies, aided by 2 million more fresh doughboys singing that annoying song over there, made a steady advance towards Germany. And on September 29th, 1918, Ludendorff informed German leaders that the war was lost and they should sue for peace. And after finding out that the Allies refused to make a peace with an autocratic imperial government, Wilhelm abdicated on November 9th, and the armistice that ended the war was signed on November 11th, 1918, and that's where Veterans Day comes in today. It was the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. So, in the terms of casualties of the war, you had around 9 million dead, 22 million were wounded, including loss of legs, arms, and other debilitating conditions. Many died later from a result of their injuries. The birth rate after after World War I in Europe declined as a result of the death or maiming of so many young men. It's known as the lost generation. Essentially you had war veterans that become accustomed to violence, and it was this lost generation, including Adolf Hitler, who would form the post-war band of fighters who supported Mussolini and the likes of Hitler in their bids for power in an attempt to make sense of a confusing world. Genocide and the mass killing of civilians, we've already mentioned this, occurred in Armenia in 1915. They started to use this as an excuse. It was an excuse. The theory was that the Armenians, led by a minority of civilians, collaborated with the Russians and ultimately led to a Turkish defeat. So the Turkish government systematically began to kill Armenian men, women, and children, and within 7 months, almost 600,000 had been killed. 400,000 were killed just through marching through the deserts of Syria and Iraq. And in the end, 1 million were victims. Disgustingly enough, this would be pale in comparison with the genocide unleashed by the Nazis and the Soviets a little bit later in the 20th century. Additionally, near the end of the war, the revolutionary upheavals in Germany and Austria-Hungary affected the political landscape of Europe mightily. Like in Russia, Germany and Austria-Hungary, they experienced all political revolution as a result of their military defeat. The German November Revolution of 1918, we'll talk a little bit more about this in chapter 26, resulted in the creation of a German republic with the socialists in power. It also created a fear as a result across the West, including the United States, about the suspiciousness or the potential rise of communists everywhere. We call that the Red Scare. So, again, later on, the series of revolutionary upheavals in Central Europe following Germany's defeat will lead to creation of numerous independent republics within the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, including Austria, a new separate Hungary, a Czechoslovakia, and one new monarchy that we'll talk about, which was in fact Yugoslavia. So we also get into the peace settlement, which wasn't an easy task. Turns out in January 1919, the delegations of 27 victorious Allied nations gathered in Paris to conclude a final settlement on the Great War. And the fact that there were 27 kind of made it a difficult task. They all kind of had their own agenda. However, 3 countries ran the proceedings, and they were called and known as the Big Three. Germany and Russia had no representation, which is going to lead to some dissent and some tension between Russia and Germany, obviously with these Allied countries into the well into the 20th century. And so here you have the Big Three. You have David Lloyd George here, Woodrow Wilson, and Georges Clemenceau of France. So let's start with Great Britain. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, had won a decisive electoral victory in December of 1918 on a platform of making Germany pay for this dreadful war. So he wasn't looking to make concessions. He wanted to hold them accountable. His goal is to want to make Germany admit guilt for starting the war and make them pay reparations. That's going to be conflicting with what Woodrow Wilson wants. France also wants to approach a peace that was primarily determined by considerations of their future, national security. French Premier Georges Clemenceau wants a demilitarized Germany, vast German war reparations or paybacks, and a separate Rhineland as a buffer zone against future German aggression against France. The United States was more interested in something called self-determination and creating a world body known as the League of Nations. This was Woodrow Wilson's masterpiece that could work cooperatively to prevent future wars. And President Wilson also urged the adoption of his infamous 14 points. Now, the final peace settlement consisted of 5 separate treaties in the end with the defeated nations of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And the most important part of this agreement in most of these cases was that the Germans in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 had to admit and agree to the following terms. They had to, number one, admit guilt, that they had started the war, and they had to pay reparations or war costs for all the Allied nations. And the total amount paid would be determined by a future reparation commission. This is known as the War Guilt Clause, also known as Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. And this is going to be the provision that particularly angers Germans in the future and will eventually lead to open hostility, and potentially you could make the claim that will lead to World War I. Germany also had to disarm or reduce its army to 100,000 men, cut way back its navy, and eliminate its air force or Luftwaffe altogether. They also had to turn over the border provinces of Alsace or Alsace and Lorraine to France. Again, remember, these two areas have been going back and forth between Germany and France since 1870, and you could also argue going all the way back, heck, to the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, but also sections of Prussia were given to the newly formed, and again, one of these ports will be Danzig, formed Poland, this new country. And so, again, leaving open hostility for future German aggression a little bit later. They'll want to get their revenge. And again, the German Rhineland region between France and Germany had to be completely demilitarized. Now, the Treaty of Versailles also created, again, a lot of discontent in Germany. And again, shown in this picture in this slide are the three most important decision makers at the Paris Peace Conference. You have George Clemenceau, Woodrow Wilson, and David Lloyd George shortly after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And again, I'm talking, of course, right here. You can see the celebratory, the smiles, even though Woodrow Wilson wasn't totally happy. I'll get into that in class. But here you also have a cartoon that shows the German reaction to what they considered an unfair peace treaty. And this is on the cover of a German satirical magazine, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but it was published in Munich. And what you have is a black man representing France seen beating a German tied to a tree trunk while an Englishman looks on with a grin on his face. And it's titled The Dictated Peace. All right, so as separate peace treaties made with other Central Powers, the empires that controlled Eastern Europe for centuries had been destroyed or weakened, like Russia, like Austria-Hungary. And a number of those new states that we talked about, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland, appear on the maps of Europe with quickly entangling alliances. We'll get into this in chapter 26. And an overall result of this peace settlement in 1919 was that Clemenceau and David Lloyd George vengeful policy would quickly lead to future European conflicts. And the United States actually never agreed to the Treaty of Versailles and never joined Wilson's League of Nations because they were disillusioned by the entire affair, and the United States will drift into a decade-long isolationism, which is also going to lead to the green light for Italians, Germans, and even Russians to essentially take over and expand their powers and basically ignore the Treaty of Versailles. So here you have a map. The victorious allies were meeting to determine the shape of the post-war Europe, those new countries that I'm talking about. Here's Yugoslavia in the Balkans. You have Romania, you have Galicia, you have Czechoslovakia, and you have a newly formed Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And coincidentally, what's going to happen here is these are going to be some of the first targets of the Russians and of the Germans as World War I breaks out. Here's, again, another something called the Mandate System that we'll learn about in terms of what happens in the Middle East in 1919. But as you can see here, the Ottoman Empire is gone. You have modern-day Turkey, you have modern-day Syria, Iraq, and eventually Iran, which, again, we'll get into a little bit later. Here you have Palestine, Jerusalem. Notice there's no Israel. But again, stay tuned for that. I hope this helps. I hope this helped you cover a lot of material early. Hope you were able to take good notes. Be ready to go in class. And again, remember, we're doing this. We got to get into the nuts and bolts of the final offensive here before May. Have a good day.